excited you're joining us today for the Free the Seeds Skill Building series. Today we're going to talk about preparing to preserve the harvest. And I'm here to share with you because I write a food blog called Twice Tasty. And I put a lot of information up there, including recipes and resources and techniques for preserving, as well as other food-related projects that you can do, everything from fermenting, making bread and cheese, to preparing the meal that you're going to eat tonight. But a big chunk of the blog focuses on preserving. I'm also currently writing my first cookbook, which is going to be all about one particular preservation technique, pickling. It's going to be out this fall. So if I lean a little heavy on pickles tonight, you'll have to forgive me. They've been on my mind for quite a while now. But pickling is just one of many preservation techniques. And I want to touch on some of the different ones that you can use. Some you may be more familiar with, some less so. And I particularly want to talk about why you might choose one over the other for particular types of food. I will also show off a few tools and things that might come in handy. I'll go through with an overview of the techniques to start, and then we'll dig into each one in a little more detail. So if you have any questions as we're going through, feel free to jump in. Issa's going to monitor comment questions that you can type in, or you can feel free to just ask them straight through the video chat. So preparing to preserve the harvest. The main thing that you need to know about that is whatever you're growing in your garden, there's almost always a way to preserve it. And it doesn't matter how much time you have, how much space you have to put it, what sort of tools and equipment you have, there's going to be some way that you can make it last a little bit longer than it would if it just came straight out of the garden and sat on your kitchen table. So I'm going to run through kind of an overview of some of these techniques to start with. The big one everybody thinks of when they think preservation is canning. And canning is actually one of the more difficult techniques. It takes more tools, it takes more time. You have to follow the rules when you can. There's no way around it. You're not going to get a safely preserved product if you don't follow canning rules. But at the same time, it's got a lot of benefits. One of the biggest benefits of canning, and the reason a lot of people do can when they garden and have big harvests, is that you can store those jars on the shelf. And if you have a small house like I do, you probably have a refrigerator with a freezer that's attached to it. I have a very small chest freezer on the side that has to store everything else. So when that space all runs out, I'm out of room to store food unless I can. That's one of the big advantages to canning. Even though you have to invest in some equipment to can, a lot of the supplies are reusable. So that also makes it really helpful when you're canning. You aren't constantly going out and buying new equipment. If you take care of it, you can usually use canning jars and kettles and the things for a really long time. I've got jars that I can with that belong to my mom and my grandmother. So it's still possible to reuse a lot of that old equipment. The other big advantage I think for canned foods is that a lot of times what you prepare, you can eat it straight from the jar. You just pop it open and it's ready to go to spread on your sandwiches, to sauce up your pasta for dinner, whatever it is you're going to do, it goes straight out of the jar into your mouth. And it's also really easy to gift because it's already saved and sealed, and you can pass it on to other people and share some of what you grew and made. So those are kind of the pros and cons for the canning step, but it's just one of the options for preserving. The next one, I'm just kind of randomly going alphabetically here, is dehydrating, which a lot of people don't think of to do unless they are going to be backpacking or doing something where they want that lighter weight food. But dehydration actually has quite a few uses. You may not really think about drying your own homegrown produce, but if you're a fan of cooking and in the kitchen and you grow herbs, you should be drying those herbs. There's no reason to buy them from the store. You're going to have such a better quality dried herb if you've grown it and saved it yourself. The dried foods, they've got a lot of pros besides being lightweight for backpacking and things like that. They pack really intense flavor. So you can get a lot more flavor from a dehydrated food than you might from something that's canned or frozen. And they also are a space saver because when they dry down, as you know, they shrink way, way down. It's a disadvantage of some things. If you like go and dehydrate huckleberries, they'll be really flavorful but incredibly tiny. but it's a huge advantage if you're trying to save space, and you can store a very large quantity of food that's dehydrated compared to storing it in other sizes. And dehydration is super easy. Canning takes process, you got to follow rules, all those things. Dehydration, as long as you can get it dry and keep the air flowing while you're doing so, so that you get it fully dry, then you're pretty much good to go. So that's kind of an overview of the pros and cons of dehydration. Dry storage is another method that I use a lot of for my root vegetables and things like that. It's even easier than dehydrating. You don't need any special tools, boxes. I use broken down old ice chests that won't hold water anymore, things like that. Any sort of container. You can pack your potatoes in there, they just go straight in. You can put onions, you can do carrots and beets and apples, are all things that you can dry store super easily. Minimal prep and handling. You don't need any special tools. And if you store them properly, they're going to keep into spring. So dry storage is really something that a lot of people don't often think about, but if you've got a big crop of root vegetables, it might be a really good way to go. It does have some disadvantages. As you know, root vegetables are bulky, so you start to fill up space real fast when you start to accumulate them in boxes. And certain varieties work better for storage, like some onions are made for sweet onions. They want to be eaten. You try to store them and keep them long term, they may start to rot. Some varieties are made for storage. So depending on what you've got in your garden, you may need to think about dry storing with next year's harvest. Plant the right varieties so that you can keep them longer into the season. And then the other disadvantage to dry storing can be that it's really temperature and humidity dependent. So you need to find a place that's going to be suitable for them. I have an unheated mudroom, which works great for a lot of my dried stored goods, but I found I have challenges with things like onions, which want to have far less humidity than is in my mudroom. So those end up having to be stored in another place, or in my case, I've actually found a couple varieties that I'm able to keep fairly well even in my mudroom. So dry storage is another possibility for preserving some of your harvest. Another way that you can preserve things, even though we don't often think of it today as preservation, is refrigeration. It's the original form of preservation, really, that got everybody all excited when refrigerators came into being. Now we often think about it as it's our day-to-day use. We're putting all of our snacks and our munchies and our leftovers and condiments in there. But if you can make space in your refrigerator, you'll also prolong the life of everything from your freshly harvested produce by just a few days to other foods that will keep for years in your refrigerator even, you know. I've got condiments in there that will last a super long time. They're homemade, and because they're refrigerated, they stay really well and long in the refrigerator. So the cool temperatures and really the widest range of produce, I think, from your garden can be stored in your refrigerator. It may not last as long as some of the other storage techniques, and it will take up space, but you've still got that option to store them in the fridge. And the last technique that I think of as a preservation technique is, of course, pickling, which is what I've been writing about recently. I'm working on for my new book, and that includes fermentation. And pickling is one of those ones where it's definitely a storage and preservation technique, and it's a really good way to store low acid safely, which means most of your vegetables and even some fruits, they're too low in acid to be able to can them without pickling them. You've got to do them in a pressure canner, or you've got to add the acid to make them safe to store on a shelf. So pickling definitely helps out in that angle. But beyond that, the variations are huge. You can pickle things really quickly to eat soon. You can pickle them and keep them in the refrigerator for weeks to months. You can ferment them and do the same, or you can can them and you can keep them for up to a year. So pickling has a huge variety in time scale. It also has a huge variety with what comes from your garden. I do some pickles where I'm literally doing a jar at a time because that's what's right in my garden right now that I need to preserve. And I do some that I do a box of at a time because everything's come off all at once and all of a sudden I have zucchini coming out of my ears. So pickling is definitely one of those ones that is a really variable technique. And there's also variations not just in volume, but also in flavors. this book that I'm writing, it's got 125 pickle recipes, and every single one tastes different. There are so many variations you can do on pickles and flavors. So if you're like, I don't like pickles, I'm not a pickle person, it may just be that you haven't tasted the right pickle yet. Um, so pickling, of course, does have some disadvantages. One is that by adding all that acid, you're often changing the flavor, whether it's a salt brine and you're making it sour, or you're adding a lot of vinegar. But that's going to change the flavor of your fresh produce. So if your favorite salsa in the world is pico de gallo, super fresh tomato salsa, it's no wonder you're not going to like trying to put that same thing into a jar and with all the acid that it needs to preserve it, because it's just not going to taste the same. There are definitely other salsas, though. They're super delicious, pickled right out of a jar. Another disadvantage to pickling is that it's a technique, but it's not a storage method. So after you pickle your food, you still have to store it using one of the other techniques we've talked about. And that's usually refrigeration, which means it takes up space in your refrigerator, or it's canning. When you can a pickle, it's going to lose crispness, it's going to lose a little bit of its nutrients through the heat processing, but you are able to preserve it. And it has the advantage of you don't have to try to put it in your fridge. I know from experience that if you try to put too many pickles in your refrigerator at one time, your refrigerator shelves are going to sag. Mine are now reinforced with metal bars to keep them all upright to hold my gallons of fermented pickles that I make every single year. Well worth the time to reinforce those fridge shelves. So those are all the overview of the methods, pros and cons for some of the preservation techniques that I use with everything that comes from my garden. And just to run through those again, we've got canning, we've got dehydration, we've got dry storage. Did I discuss freezing, or did I skip that? I believe I skipped freezing. Freezing, I should have talked about that already. Freezing is another great one for preservation. Minimal prep most of the time when you freeze. I actually do a lot of freezing as an in-between step, where I know I want to make some strawberry jam or can my tomato salsa, and I'm either waiting for a big enough crop or I just don't have the time when everything's ripe. I can put it in the freezer and I can bring it out and process it later. So I use it a lot of times throughout the summer for an in-between step. And then by the end of the season, I've chocked my freezer full with stuff that I'm going to eat all winter long. It clamps down on the bacteria and things like that, even more so than refrigeration. So the cold temperatures of a fridge will slow the spoilage, but they won't really stop it. As you know, you put something in the fridge, you leave it too long, it can spoil. Freezing does a little bit better job of that with the even colder. And it also keeps that fresher flavor a little bit longer. But there are some downsides, of course. Most people have limited freezer space, and it takes energy and space to run freezers. It also is, food expands when it freezes. So even though you think you've got this giant freezer and a lot of space, if you have one, you'll know it fills up really quickly. And as that food starts to expand, you lose even more space and real estate in your freezer. And it's also, the bigger your freezer, the harder it is to keep track of what's in there. It doesn't matter how well you package it and label it and proportion it. Big freezers are just a challenge to manage. So those are some disadvantages to the freezing side. So I think I've covered all my basics now: canning, dehydrating, dry storage, freezing, pickling, including fermenting, and refrigerating. So before I move on, we got any questions about pros and cons overall of these techniques? I'll talk a little bit more about specifics for certain fruits and vegetables, but overall, are there any questions?
I actually have a question.
Sure.
Have you ever tried dehydrating? I mean, not dehydrating, freeze drying.
I have not. It's a technique that requires some more special tools, and I have a small house, so I haven't gone that route. Most people I know who do the freeze drying are they find that they've decided to invest in it because they're doing a lot of backpacking, particularly people who are guiding or doing things like that, backpacking, backcountry travel and things like that. They'll go out and invest in the equipment and supplies, but I have not messed with it otherwise. So,
Thank you.
yeah. I do pretty well with a food dehydrator, though. This is my dehydrator back here. Um, you can vaguely see it. But I use that for everything from snack foods and small things to I'll do soups and stews that I dehydrate that we then use and take backpacking and things like that. Um, so there are a range of things that you can do in there, but the freeze drying is definitely another level that I haven't gone into. So,
I had a question.
go for it.
Sorry, about the dry storage. I was just wondering if you ever have problem with pests or anything, or how you were able to prevent pests from getting into the dry storage, but not get it too humid or sealed that it still has airflow.
I fortunately have not had any problems with pests. And part of that is, I think, just making sure that I don't have pests coming into the space to begin with. So, and then as far as like, rodent style pests and things like that, protecting them from the space is definitely going to be helping with that. Because part of the problem otherwise is you still want that stuff to breathe. So like if you were to say, I use an old ice chest to store my potatoes in, and I leave the lid open and I put a towel over the top of it to keep it dark in there, and the potatoes do great. I found that by putting a rack, I built a little wooden just lath rack underneath to keep the potatoes off the bottom and keep the moisture out of there as well. So that lets it breathe, but it is open if I were to have rodents or something like that. It is open to that. So the main thing is just to keep them out of the space overall. And then as far as any sort of insecty pests, things like that, a lot of those would develop because of spoilage. So when I dry store, I make sure that I'm keeping an eye on the quality of what's in there. Every time I go in to grab something, I kind of sift through and make sure that things aren't getting spoiled in there, and that keeps like the smaller insect pests away.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. So let's move on, and since we're on dry storage, why don't we start there? Talk a little bit more about some things that I do for making sure that dry stored stuff keeps really well. The first thing that I do is I sort through my produce when I go to store it. So with dry storage in particular, because you're putting a whole bunch of produce into one space and you've got limited control over temperature, and you put it in the proper temperature, you put it with proper humidity, your location, but otherwise you don't have a lot of control over what's going on in that box. So I make sure when I dry store stuff, I start out with the driest produce, the freshest produce. Anything that's got spoilage on it doesn't go in that box. It gets processed some other way. A lot of the stuff that you may want to dry store, things like onions, potatoes, and all those things, they want to cure before they go in the box. So once you pull them out of the ground, curing time for onions can be, depending on the temperature of your space, can be a couple of days to a couple of weeks. I try to cure them as long as I can before I put them in the box, and then I find that I have better results with that. Potatoes are the same way. If you take them straight from the ground, dig them into your bucket, and then you just cover that bucket and store it, they're not going to last as long as if you actually spread them out, let them dry out a little bit, double check that you don't have any in there that you cut with your shovel by mistake, or any that had spoiled spots on them, and then pack the good stuff away. You'll get far better results if you just make sure what you put into that box has been well monitored. And then the other thing that I do, like I said, for pests and things, is I check on them regularly. It's a good practice. I don't really have a schedule, but if you're a person who needs a schedule, I would recommend checking on your dry stored stuff once a week. For one thing, it'll encourage you to use it, and you'll remember that it's there, and you're like, oh yeah, I grew that, I want to eat that. But for another thing, I think it really helps to keep track of the quality of what's in your boxes. And if you check on it regularly, then you can catch something before it starts to spoil, because once that spoilage starts, if you don't catch it in time, it can spread to a good chunk of what you've stashed away. So for dry storage, like I said, there really aren't a lot of special tools. The main thing you need is a cool, dry place. And on my food blog, I've got information up there that talks about different temperatures and humidities for various fruits and vegetables. And we're not talking super scientific. You got to get some sort of scale and whatever else out. It's a lot of it's really intuitive. My mudroom tends to be quite humid because it's unheated, but it tends to be cool. So it works for the cool side. Anything that can't handle the humidity, it's better in a box under the bed or in the closet or something like that. There's a lot of other places you can put those things. Just get my camera back there. There we go. So, excuse me. So yeah, once you get your temperature and humidity figured out and where you want to put your stuff, keeping an eye on it is really going to help things be stored well. Besides a cool, dry space and some sort of container to put your dry stored goods in, the only other things that I often use are, if I'm going to dry store apples, it works a lot better if they are individually wrapped, I've found. Excuse me. And I actually consider herbs a dry stored option. You can preserve them in salt, and I consider that dry storage. They just get layered into a jar with salt, and the herbs themselves can be used, and then the salt picks up the oils and their flavor, and you've got a flavored herb salt at the same time. And I've got a recipe that talks about how to do that actual process up on my blog as well. So, little brief overview of dry storage. Any questions, more questions related to that one? All right, let's go back to dehydration since we were talking about that a little bit ago. With dried food, there are definitely some things that'll make it work a little bit better. You can dry things just by laying them out or by hanging them. It's a real challenge to get them to dry thoroughly here in Montana, though. If you've tried, you'll know. Just the other day, we thought, oh, we'll pull some dill, we'll just hang it in the garden. It's a gorgeous sunny day. And then it rained that night at midnight for 3 hours and no longer have dried dill. So to my mind, it is worth the investment of a food dehydrator if you're going to do any sort of serious dehydrating. By all means, give it a try, play with it, with whatever you've got. But a dehydrator will really help. My dehydrator is super simple. And inexpensive. It just comes in these stacked layers. Mine is old, but it just comes in these stacked layered trays, and they have space on them for venting. The dehydrator has a temperature control. It has a venting. It has airflow because it's electric. And so it just dries things at whatever temperature you need for that particular product. Herbs want to dry at a super low temperature, otherwise you're just going to bake them. Fruit leather and dried fruits, they want to dry at a higher temperature, so that you don't have them spoil and you actually suck out all of that excess moisture that's in them. So a dehydrator is a worthwhile investment if you are going to think seriously about preserving stuff. When you use a dehydrator, let everything in it cool completely. Since mine has a temperature control, when I first unplug it, it'll feel warm in there. So let it come down to room temperature and then check it to see that it's actually fully dry. If you check it while it's still warm, you won't get a good read on whether something's really truly dry or not. When you go to store your dried stuff, that's the other part of the dehydration process. When you go to store your dried herbs, you'll get the best effect if you store them as whole as you possibly can. So in the dehydrator right now, I had basil leaves. I'm going to just pick those up off of there, put them into a bag or a container right the size that they are, and store them that way. So if I were to crush them now to the size that I'd want to use them in, I lose all that flavor and oils. I want that to come out exactly when I use it. And the other thing that'll really help when you go to store dried foods is if you store them in the portions that you're planning to use. if you do a giant bag of something and you have something that's in it, then you're going to spoil your entire batch. So if you go and you store it in smaller batches as you'll use them, one thing, you'll potentially cut down on spoilage if you had something that didn't totally dry. But for another thing, you'll keep all of that excess air out of there so that every time you open a container, you let air in, you let moisture in, things can tend to spoil. And then when you go and you store your dried food, store it at a cool temperature. If you store it in a warmer place, it's not going to last nearly as long. You don't need a lot of special tools beyond your dehydrator, which will really help. You don't need a lot of special tools in order to do dehydration. Something that's going to be airtight, whether it's a bag or a container, is super helpful. I find it really helpful to label everything that I dehydrate, all the bags, because what is in a dried bag doesn't necessarily look like the food that you thought it was when you put it out there. And it's going to be really hard to know ahead of time whether what you've just picked up is mint or oregano. And when you're in the kitchen working quickly, it's a good idea to know.
Hey, Julie, so do you put anything else in when you're storing dehydrated fruits, especially have a high moisture content to start with? Do you put any like rice or anything that might absorb any additional moisture that would get in there afterwards? Or do you just store it as is?
I store it as is. You certainly can put in something that works kind of like a desiccant, but that's really just a Band-Aid for the bigger problem that the food wasn't fully dry. And depending on how much moisture is actually in there, it may or may not be effective, and you may still end up with mold and spoilage. So what I try to do is make sure I've gotten everything fully dry. So when I do the herbs and things like that, grab one of these here. And I go to bend it, it should crack, it should break really easily. If I were to bend it and it just kind of softly bent over and didn't come apart, I'd throw it back in the dehydrator. I'd do it for more time. Which is something when you're dehydrating, people often want to know, how long do I have to dry it for? And a lot of times somebody will tell you a variation that varies by hours. They'll be like, oh, 4 to 12 hours. And it really depends on the amount of moisture that's in there to start with, which depends on the quality of what came out of your garden, what it is you're making. If I make fruit leather, depending on how much juice I had in it versus how much solid, it can take a really wide range of time to dehydrate. So, so making sure it's fully dried, everything should break like that and be consistently dried. And if it's not, then you throw it back into the dehydrator, let it go for some more time. The only thing I do if I do find that I've come up with something and it seems to have too much moisture in it, at that point, I'll throw it in the freezer and use it straight away. It's if I'm concerned that it's not going to stay dehydrated. So.
Thank you.
Every dehydrator works a little bit differently. Temperatures run a little bit differently. So don't be disappointed if you find you've dried something and it takes you far longer than whatever instruction you happen to be following. Just keep going until it feels right.
Great, thank you.
Any other dehydration questions?
You mentioned that you do dehydrated soups. Could you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, dehydrating soups is something I started doing for backpacking, and it works really well to come up with a home dehydrated version if you go into it knowing I want to make this soup to dehydrate it. I found that things that are more stew-like with chunkier vegetables and things like that are going to be in pieces rather than like a cream soup dehydrates a lot better. And when I do it, I make that soup to the same recipe I would if I was going to eat it fresh, except for the liquid. I use the bare minimum possible liquid. So if I'm going to make a vegetable stew or a fish stew to dehydrate, I'll follow the recipe that I might make to use it at home, but I'll just put in enough liquid in there to actually make it work, get the sauciness, the stew flavor, and all that kind of stuff. Because the more liquid that's in there, the more you've got to dry out of it when you go and put it in your dehydrator to get it dry. So your best bet is going to be to have that liquid as minimal as possible. So I do it with kind of soups and chowders and things like that, and then you just dry them up like you would anything else. The trays that I have in this dehydrator had the mesh part on them, so you can put a the dehydrators, they usually make a tray for it that's a solid base tray, or you can use food grade plastic that you can cut to the shape of your dehydrator to make a sleeve there that'll hold the liquids. And I use the same sort of sleeve for like a fruit leather and stuff as well.
Great,
So,
thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. So from dehydration, let's move on to freezing. Freezing what's coming out of your garden. Even though you can just take something and throw it in the freezer and do it super simply and easily in whatever fits in whatever container or bag you happen to have, I found that it's really helpful to actually weigh and measure that food before it goes into the freezer. I'm a huge fan of kitchen scales, especially if you're a gardener and you're growing your own food. If you try to read a recipe and look at, it says, you know, take 4 bell peppers, your homegrown bell peppers aren't going to be the same size as your store-bought ones. And so doing things by weight works a whole lot better than doing things by volume. And that is true when you're freezing. If you say, okay, I'm going to freeze this bag of strawberries, instead of just putting as many as you can into your freezer bag, if you actually weigh out and mark on there how many you have, then you know when you go to use it what you've got and how much you need to pull out at a time. So freezer scales can be small, can be simple, inexpensive food scales. So I always make sure when I'm doing it, I get one that has both grams and pounds on it because I make bread and I weigh all my bread weights in grams. But for gardening, the main thing I look for is that it's going to hold a fair amount of weight. This little scale will measure up to 11 pounds. So I find that anything that's not going to do several pounds at a time isn't going to be as useful to you with what's coming out of your garden. Because if you've ever done a harvest of zucchini, you know it's pretty easy to come up with 11 pounds that you're trying to weigh out all at once, whether it's for canning or freezing. So weighing it and then freezing it in those portions will be really helpful, whether it's just to know what you've got for a recipe or whether it's just to keep track of the volume of things that's in your freezer. And the other thing that I do, of course, is when I write on there, I write down both the weight and the contents, because again, like dried foods, they may not look the same once it's fully frozen in the bag. And I also date it and try to make sure that I'm rotating through my frozen foods and not letting something just get buried at the bottom of the freezer. So when I do dredge up from the bottom something I missed and realized it's got a date that's from a year or two old, that goes to the top of the pile. I use that first. So even though it seems like, oh, I can just throw it in the bag and I'll remember what it is, you won't. So mark it, label it. It's really helpful. For tools for a freezer, besides the freezer itself, I do recommend the scale. Make sure the bags and containers you are using are freezer proof. You can, a lot of people these days are trying to avoid plastic, and you can do that with freezing. You can freeze in glass, but it's definitely something you need to be cautious about because food expands and you've got to leave a lot more room if you're going to freeze in glass. I don't freeze in glass because my main storage space is a chest freezer, and I find it really hard to use glass containers, glass jars and things in that size of freezer space because everything's getting packed on top of each other. People I do know who freeze in glass often have upright freezers, and they find that that works a little bit better. You can also freeze in stainless steel containers, which are fantastic. They're just super expensive. But companies are starting to make that as a freezer option. So those are definitely some plastic-free options. I still tend to freeze in plastic just because it's affordable and fits in my freezer space. When I do that, I make sure that I'm defrosting that food enough to get it out of the plastic container before I try to heat it rather than reheating it in the plastic itself, you know, and sticking it in the microwave or something like that. Definitely make sure you're getting it out of there. before you go to heat it up. Besides that, I make use of ice cube trays, one of my favorite freezer tools for produce, because you can freeze all sorts of things in teeny tiny portions the size of a cube, and then you've got them ready to go for whatever you want to do. So I will freeze everything from herbs just in water or as a pesto base in ice cube trays. I freeze garlic and oil in ice cube trays. I freeze fruit, particularly fruit solids. I make a lot of fruit syrups and shrubs and things where I'm separating out the liquid and the juice, and then I've got the solids left over. I'll freeze the solids in cubes to drop into smoothies. And if I've got the juice, I'll freeze the juice in cubes if I'm trying to preserve it, fresh juice, longer than I was able to. And once it's frozen in the cubes, you can pop it out of the cubes, put it into a bag and label it, and you can just keep freezing those small batches. And then you don't have this big clumpy mess of stuff to try to take out of your freezer and carve a chunk off of when you go to use something. On the same lines, a lot of things that do tend to clump in the freezer, like fruits, berries, corn, trying to think, anything of those smaller pieces that do want to kind of clump up once they've been in the freezer for a long time, particularly if the freezer door gets open and closed a lot. Those things I'll freeze first onto a tray, just a rimmed baking sheet or tray of some sort, until they're frozen solid individually, and then I'll throw them into bags. So if you've ever frozen a bag of strawberries, by the time you pack the fresh strawberries just in the bag and you even get it to the freezer, it's already starting to smush down. Raspberries, even more so. But if you freeze those flat on a tray first until they're totally frozen solid, and then you bag them, they'll retain their shape, and you'll be able to pull out smaller quantities if you need, or have it come out without it just being this giant, clumpy, juicy mass bag. And again, marking and labeling things. I found that some of the best ways are to actually write on the bags or containers if you can. My mom, when I was a kid, used to always slide a piece of paper down with a handwritten note on it of what was in it. It gets soggy, it gets colored, it doesn't work. Permanent marker on the bag, masking tape taped onto the top of the container before it goes in the freezer, when it will still stick and adhere to the container, and then permanent marker on that are kind of the best ways to mark those up. For freezing, you can freeze a wide range of fruits. I freeze herbs, I freeze berries, vegetables, asparagus, carrots, cucumbers, and zucchini. I all freeze grated. I grate them first and let them drain, and then stick them into freezer bags and freeze them that way to turn into carrot cake, zucchini bread. Cucumbers, I freeze the gratings of cucumbers, and I make tzatziki, Greek dip, all winter long to go with falafel and my homemade sourdough pitas and things. So that kind of soft stuff that doesn't normally freeze well, you can freeze and grate. Some things you can freeze whole besides things that are obvious, like berries and stuff. Corn, I grill usually. Is my preferred way to have corn. We do it all on the grill. I cut it off the cob, freeze it on the tray, and then I've got the corn pieces whole. Small tomatoes you can freeze whole. Just literally, you don't even have to do them on the tray first because they've got enough of a skin to keep separated. Cherry tomatoes, I just drop into a bag and fill. Anything up to like your plum tomato size, you can still freeze in that way. And then when you go to pull them out of the freezer, if you don't want the skins on them, they're going to slip right off as they defrost. If you don't care that the skins are on them, you can throw them straight into a pan. I have a recipe on the blog for a pasta sauce with cherry tomatoes that I make all winter. With the frozen ones, I literally empty the bag from the freezer, the bag into the pan, and as everything's heating up, it's defrosting it right there in the pan, making the sauce. So those small tomatoes freeze really well that way. Eggplant and asparagus are things that I puree and then freeze. Eggplant I grill and then puree and freeze and make it into baba ganoush. Onions I also grill, chop, and freeze. And if I've got onions that I grew that aren't a good storage variety, that's a good way to keep them. And yeah, the list is huge, really. The only things that I treat with any sort of special care for freezing, besides grilling some of the vegetables, mostly because I prefer the grilled flavor, is broccoli. I do recommend blanching broccoli before you freeze it. I've tried freezing it straight off and it develops an off flavor um, during the storage if you don't blanch it first. A lot of preservationists and the old school techniques will tell you that a lot of vegetables should be blanched before you freeze them, but I found that while you may get a little bit of a improved flavor quality, may retain a few nutrients from that, in a lot of cases, I don't see a huge quality difference. So I don't bother with that extra step, particularly if you're going to try to use your food over the course of your growing season, make room for what comes next season. You should be able to get along just fine without blanching most things. But broccoli is an exception. It will taste really funny if you don't give it a treatment. So anything else for freezing wise?
Do you see an advantage of using a vacuum sealer for any particular vegetables or fruits before you freeze it? Or doesn't it matter?
There's definitely an advantage in terms of it's gonna suck out more of that air. You're gonna get less freezer burn. You're gonna get more longevity. I find, however, that the way I use things, I'm a household of two, and if I were the disadvantage of vacuum sealing something is that once you open that bag, you've lost all of that benefit from the vacuum seal. So if you're not going to use the entire bag at a time, then your vacuum sealing is only as effective as the first time you open it. After that, you're going to have to rebag it into another container. And I find that since I'm a household of two and I make a lot of food even just for myself, I'm often reaching into a bag, taking out a handful of this and putting the bag back in the freezer. But if you are able to freeze in portions where you're going to be able to use the whole bag, vacuum sealing definitely has an advantage. And particularly, I find for fruits and vegetables and things like that, it is advantageous, particularly advantageous if you're doing any sort of meats. If my sister lives out on the coast, they're freezing fish and shellfish and things like that. That definitely benefits from getting the vacuum seal. Any sort of, if you're doing farm raised meats here around Montana, definitely the vacuum seal bag is going to be much more useful than for your fruit and veg.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we got a couple more categories to run through. Real quickly, I'm going to run over refrigeration. Couple things that you may or may not know about your refrigerators, because we just plug them in and turn them on and away they go. Go ahead and check and see what that setting is. If you have a refrigerator setting between 35 degrees and 38 degrees, you're going to get the best benefit from your refrigerator in terms of storage. Food for refrigeration purposes really wants to be 40 degrees as the temperature of the food itself. So if you set your refrigerator temperature slightly lower, you're going to make sure that that food is getting the ultimate preservation temperature. Whether that's for just your daily usage greens or longer term storage of stuff. The other thing is that things that go into the fridge, the fresher they are and the drier they are, the longer they're going to last. And this is true of everything. You know, as you know, if you bring something in from the garden and it's started to wilt before it even gets to the refrigerator or your house, it's never going to get that crispness back. You know, you can try, you can put your carrots in water, you can put ice cubes over your cucumbers, but it's never going to have that same crispness once it starts to lose it. So the more you can do to get that harvest quickly from the garden to the cold storage, the better results you're definitely going to have. The other thing that I've done recently and discovered with refrigeration is that if I store things in cloth bags for fresh produce, I get better results. And I know there's some back and forth on this. I was just having a conversation with someone about this last night, where they had been advised to not let too much air into the produce because it was going to wilt and go bad that way. But what I've found is I have the bigger problems, especially when I keep my refrigerator at the proper cold temperature for storage. I have bigger problems with things molding as fresh produce than I do with things getting wilty. And so what I've been doing is cloth bags, and I've got directions actually up on my blog for these ones. They are super simple. It's a piece of fabric that is folded in half on one side. It gets stitched on the other side and stitched on the other side. And when you stitch that last side in, you stitch in a bit of twill tape, finish off the seams, and you've got a food storage bag. These are great. I make them out of as light of weight cotton as I can find, trying to do natural material, and I try to make them as light as weight as I can, because then I can take them with me to the market when they allow you to get bulk foods. I can take them with me to the market and put my bulk produce and beans and rice and anything else in them and use them as market bags as well. But I found that by putting my greens, all my vegetables and things like that in these kind of bags, I extend my life by several days in the refrigerator, if not a couple of weeks. Because the refrigerator, even though it's somewhat counterintuitive, you think, oh, it's also moist and humid in there. Fridges actually dry things out. So if I do let it sit too long in the bag, then I can find that it'll get more wilted, but I don't find the mold and the slimy stuff that I end up with if I'm using a plastic bag or something like that. This is essentially going to give you the same effect as a mesh produce bag, storage bag, which are also becoming really common. I went ahead with this route because with the volume of produce I bring in over the summer, I was going to have to spend a lot of money to buy bags, and like the idea of just using up scrap fabric. So these work super well for that. I also use them to store breads in. I just make them in whatever scrap fabric size I happen to have, and then I can store all sorts of things in them. So those work really well in the refrigerator. And like I said earlier, refrigeration is kind of the widest range of things that you can store. Short term, I preserve all sorts of things in these cloth bags. Things that I just put in the refrigerator whole and without any sort of bagging are like cabbage and plums and pears and apples and things. Apples actually keep a really long time in the refrigerator, as do beets, carrots, green tomatoes, tomatillos, zucchini. All those things can last for quite a long time in a refrigerator drawer, just as is, if they're unspoiled and undamaged. You'll still get longer storage in terms of dry storage and things like that. But if at the end of the season you're like, oh, I've got an extra bag of carrots, it'll keep longer in the fridge than you might initially think. And of course, the refrigerator is your storage for all of your other prepared foods, pickled, fermented, condiments, anything else that you're making like that out of the garden that you've gone ahead and prepared to the next level can also get stored in your refrigerator. Any other questions there? So I'm going to move on to canning. Oh, one more thing about refrigeration while I'm there is when it does come to refrigeration storage, I found, especially for things that you're preserving in jars like pickles and fermented foods and things like that, is non-reactive lids have become something I'm willing to invest in. I first started out storing everything with just old canning lids and rings for all my ferments and stuff, and they'll rust. They aren't made for that kind of storage. So I found that the investment in non-reactive lids is actually really worthwhile to avoid getting that rust and crustiness and stuff on there. And they come in a really wide range now. You can get them, this one's plastic, food grade plastic. It's got a little rubber seal on the inside of it. You can also get them in stainless steel, as solid one-piece lids with, again, a seal inside to help everything seal closed. And they also make rings now that are stainless steel as well. Just that look just like your canning rings, only these, they're stainless steel. If you touch them, they're often labeled. They aren't recommended for using in the canning kettle because they haven't been threaded by the same company that makes the canning jars, but they are fantastic for storage, and I can use these over and over and over for years without getting them all rusty or getting all that kind of gunk into my food because the jar rim's rusted. So that's one other thing that I find really useful with fridge storage. With canning itself, you do end up with some more specialized supplies. And here I'm going to swap my screen around if I can. And come on. There we go. So got a few canning supplies here. Besides your canning kettle and, of course, your jars, so you've got your small canning jars like this. You want to, if you're going to can, you definitely want canning specific jars, even though it's tempting to use the ones that came from the grocery store with pasta sauce or pickles or whatever else in them. They aren't made to withstand the heat processing that happens in home canning. So you'll definitely want to have canning jars for your canning process. Again, like those stainless steel rings I just showed you, there are also rings that are made for the canning jars, the bands that go on. These are reusable for canning as long as they don't get rusty and they don't get bent and damaged. And then the other thing you need are the lids that go on them. And the lids themselves can only be used one time for canning. Once that rubber seal's been imprinted, it can't be reused again. I do reuse those still for dry storage and, you know, of beans and rice and things like that that are stored in jars. But like I said, I found that with anything that's going to get stored in the refrigerator for a long time, and particularly anything acidic like pickles, using a different lid instead of the old ones is really beneficial. But you'll need the new ones in order to can. The other things that I use for canning that are really helpful are a jar lifter. And the jar lifter is basically, as it looks like, just an oversized set of tongs here. Really helpful for getting those jars in and out of the hot water bath, because otherwise it can be a little dangerous to try to pick them up in and out of there. A wide mouth funnel is also really useful. If you look at this thing, it's got a different bottom that actually fits inside the jar and makes everything else wider. Super easy to clean up on the messes. You may have also seen some of the canning equipment setups that come with those tools also come with a bubble remover. I just use a bamboo chopstick to get down in there and lift out the bubbles and remove it. It works super easy. Don't use one that's been coated with plastic, high quality one that you think of for eating and sushi and all that kind of stuff. It may seem like a good idea, but that plastic can again melt in the heat and not so useful. And then back here you can see I've got my canning kettle, one of those old speckled style kettles. You can have one of those for canning, but you don't need one. What you do need is you need a kettle that's going to be have a lid on it. It needs some sort of a rack or base that goes inside. They make silicone bases now that can go into a stock pot. You can stack up some canning lids, something that keeps your jars off the bottom of the canning kettle. And you need it to be tall enough that it leaves at least an inch when it's totally full with all your jars. There's at least an inch of water over the top that's not going to bubble out as it goes through its processing time. So when you think about picking up your equipment and preparing to can, that's the main thing you're looking for as a kettle, is getting one that's tall enough. If you've got a stock pot that does that, fantastic. If you don't, that's going to be a worthwhile investment, because you definitely want to make sure that water has at least an inch above those jars. Otherwise, you're not going to get a safe seal on your canning jar.
Hey, Julie, we have about 1 more minute left.
All right.
I know it goes by so quickly, doesn't it?
It does, and there's so much to cover. So that's kind of the overview of the canning equipment. And as I said, I thought I'd get to talk about pickling and fermenting, but obviously we've run out of time. What I will say though is that up on my food blog, you'll find a lot more information about all this stuff, including recipes for all of these things. And I have also all this month long been focusing on this talk and preparing to preserve things on the blog. So if you look at the most recent blog post, you'll find a lot of the information I talked about here today. You'll also find some additional information. Tomorrow's post, they'll go live, will have a dehydration post and a new recipe for dehydrating tomatoes that I really enjoy, or Italian spiced tomatoes. So definitely get to the blog and check those out. Isa will also put up some of those links when she posts the video on Free the Seeds. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was fantastic. I know it's a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, but the idea is that we're really trying to make sure that, you know, you get a broad sense of things that you might be interested in looking into a little bit more deeply. And as Julie said, she has a Twice as Tasty blog, fantastic resources, books, blog posts, recipes on there, and we will post that on Free the Seeds site. So thank you, Julie. And before we wrap up, I just want to mention we have another session coming up in August, preparing for fall. We'll be talking about good vegetables to start planning to plant to have a harvest into fall and winter, as well as thinking about what sort of plants you may want to save seeds from. Robin Kelson from the Good Seed Company will be working with Sandy Birch to present those topics. So that'll be a fantastic session. And again, we will send out an email with a registration link in advance. Like usually I send it out the Sunday before, and we'll probably do that the Wednesday following in August, and that will be on the site as well. So thank you again, and thank everybody for attending, and look for the recording to share on freetheseedsmontana.com, all spelled out under the Build Skills section. And enjoy your summer. It's a beautiful day out there today, so you hopefully can get a little sunshine before the sun goes down.